Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's MPG Primer. We are very excited to have Dr. Anna Lewis here with us today. She is a research scientist in Robert Greene's Genomics to Peoples group at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. She's a bioethicist with a main focus on the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics and genomic technologies. She received her doctoral training in systems biology from the University of Oxford and has worked for several years in the genetics industry. Her work integrates empirical and normative methodologies, as always done in close collaboration with scientists and healthcare providers. She's also a member of numerous national and international ethics advisory and policy setting groups, and closer to home is co-leader of the Broad Bioethics Initiative. We're very excited to have Dr. Lewis here today. She's glad to take your questions during her talk, so I'll monitor the Q&A if you're on Zoom, and please just feel free to come up to the mics at any time if you're here in person.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. So this is a very broad topic, ethical issues in genomics research. Here's the overview of what I'm hoping to discuss with you today. So I'm going to, first of all, really by way of preamble, talk about why genomics, why are we talking about ethical issues in genomics specifically, and what types of issues have come up. But the meat of what I want to talk about is more about the process of what grappling with an ethical issue in genomics might look like. So what do we mean by ethics and ethical issues, and what might applying the ethics lens look like, with plenty of examples. And yeah, I just think that this is what I want you to take away from the talk about this process of grappling with ethical issues and what that might look like. And this is quite a sort of personal take on this subject. You could hear from a different bioethicist and hear something different. Okay, so why ethics of genomics? Human subjects research, big topic. That's what you should go through the IRB to get any human subjects researched approved. There's an associated set of ethical issues that come up alongside the regulatory ones whenever you're dealing with human subjects in your research. So all of those things apply when we're thinking about genomics, plus a sort of special nature of genetic information raises other issues. So the fact that it's shared with the family and more distant relatives, that it can be identifying, that it's immutable, that it's predictive from birth. And then also in our field, we've got the history of the entanglement with eugenics and racist ideas about genetic difference. So all of these things lead to a very lively field. And indeed it is a field. It's called the Ethical, Legal, Social Implications of Genetics and Genomics, or ELSI. And its backstory goes like this. In the late 1980s, when Watson and others were trying to get the Human Genome Project off the ground, they faced just a huge amount of concern and questioning from the general public, and from various other academics, etc. And due to that, they set aside a percentage of the HGP's budget to grapple with what became known as ELSI issues. And in 1993, that became a federal mandate, i.e. it was formalized in law that the National Human Genome Research Institute spend 5% of its annual budget on these issues. And today, you'll often find, particularly in the RFAs for the really big pots of money, that they require some sort of ELSI component to attract the funding for the science. So that's the field. And then here's just an overview, high-level overview of some of the areas where ethical issues have been raised. And this is definitely non-exhaustive. We could think about the issues that have been raised in the clinic, genetic testing, outside the clinic, and then in research. And I don't necessarily want to go through this list, but for example, if we look at genetic testing, there have been lots of concerns raised about the potential harms of a psychosocial nature, about genetic discrimination, about access and equity to testing, special issues that coming up testing of embryos and fetuses, the fact that the information is uncertain and what does that mean when sharing it with individuals, and privacy and data access are just some of the areas that the ELSI work has taken on. But as I explained, I want to get at this idea of ethics as process. So what do we mean by ethics? There are many definitions out there, but here's a simple one, that it's just the attempt to answer, what should I do? And it's a process of articulating moral values and their practical implications, suggesting courses of action that can be rationally justified. So that last bit just means that you're able to give reasons for the recommendations or suggestions that you might make. Okay, so we saw in that definition contains the idea of a moral value. Well, what do we mean by a value? It's anything that has some sort of intrinsic worth. Something, it doesn't rely on something else to justify why it has any worth. And here are just some examples to throw out there. Compassion, respect, justice, generosity, truthfulness, benevolence, freedom. All of these things can be seen as having intrinsic worth. And then what's an ethical issue? Here's the definition I want to put to you today, where we risk courses of action that undermine some of our values because of conflict or apparent conflict between values, or because of failure to attend to a particular value. So how do we know if there's one of these, arising in our work or our day-to-day lives or whatever? Well, these issues, they don't stand up and announce themselves. It's not always clear when there is, in fact, an ethical issue to be grappled with. And initial recognition of something as an ethical issue could come from various places. So I think often if there's non-technical disagreement in a team about what the sort of correct path of action might be, that might, raise some hairs and think, oh, maybe this is a ethical issue when it comes down to it. Or if there are some unexpected emotional reactions to something that's going on, again, that could be a little alert that maybe there's something here of an ethical nature. I also find that discussing things that I work on with people who have no relationship to the field, it's interesting what they then first ask about, what their first concerns are. And sometimes that can also alert us to some sort of ethical issue that's at play. And also a process of deliberate reflection, using some of the things that I'm going to go on to talk about. Just sort of like purposely sitting down and thinking, well, what's going on in my research area, for example. So what might it mean to, as I'm phrasing it here, apply the ethics lens? That would be about recognizing where we're undermining values we care about and addressing them by seeking solutions that allow us to uphold these values to the best of our abilities. There are some challenges inherent to applying that ethical lens that I want to go through one by one in the remainder of this talk. So we're going to talk about what values are important and whose values are important, what it might mean to uphold those values. That was part of this definition of applying the ethics lens. How do we recognize where those values are being undermined? What approaches might allow us to uphold all the values identified? And what if there are no such approaches or solutions? So we'll look at those one by one. What values are important? So I'd just like you all to just take a moment to think about what values are most important to you in your personal lives. And this is a non-exhaustive set. And I'm not going to call on any of you as individuals to name the ones that really stood out most to you. But what I do bet is that they would be different from each other. And it's also probably the case that you're on board with with all of these probably. It's just some might have more salience than others. So what about this question? What values are important in your professional life as a genomics researcher? Again, just a short while to think about that. Here are some that some of you may have thought of. Fairness, accountability, stewardship, openness, objectivity, honesty, but I'm sure many other things as well. And afterwards, if any of you would like to share, I would be very interested to hear what you thought of. And a somewhat rhetorical question for you is, are your personal values still relevant in your professional life? And the answer is yes, right? We are not automatons. This is something that we bring to our work. We don't have to strip away those things which are of value to us when we don our professional hats. And just a quick note that in the literature, the term values and principles are used somewhat but not completely interchangeably, and I'm going to stick to values here. Okay, so then specifically when we talk about if we think about genomics research and we think about the sort of big values that people rally under, for all research, truthfulness is something that often stands out first and foremost. For human subjects research, a report a very, very influential report that came out in the 70s that tried to codify what were the most important values or principles for human subjects research, pointed out respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And that's now codified in the common rule, which is the thing that dictates how IRBs need to make decisions. And then what about your research? Are there particular values which might come up to the fore in your particular domain? So for some people, anti-racism as a value becomes very important in genetics because of the specific history of genetics and its forebears, treating group categories as natural. And that has had very damaging social consequences. So it might be that we have a particularly important commitment to uphold the value of anti-racism, which is a commitment to undo the use of concepts and practices of systemic racism and colonialism wherever they may be in operation. Okay, so whose values are important? There's no cookie cutter answer to this, but let me put to you that those who could be impacted by the results of your research should be centered. So in translational research, that could be those living with whatever the target indication is that you're working on. In ancient DNA research, that could be the descendants of those you're researching. And in some research, particularly in this crowd, that could be all humans. Then there's a separate group of people who are your prospective research participants. Then there's you and your team, the research team, and other stakeholders should probably have their values considered as well, including the people who are funding your research. And particularly if that's taxpayer funded, then the general public, regulators, and an early task would be to really think about whose values are important in a given situation. And then you might well find that you've got different groups of people putting different weights on different values. So it's a useful exercise to think about which values does everybody agree on versus which values might one group have that are not so important to another group. Okay, second issue. What might it mean to uphold those values? So there's a process that gets called value specification. So these values, we just had a bunch of examples, are highly abstract concepts. And specification is the process of making these abstract concepts action guiding, perhaps in the form of moral rules and duties. So here's an example using those 3 values or principles that come up in human subjects research. Respect for persons is the first one. And again, in this Belmont report that I mentioned earlier from the late 1970s, they said, well, what does that actually mean in practice? Well, for human subjects research, respect for this value means the need for informed consent. And then they hash out some of the parameters of that. Likewise, upholding the value of beneficence in the case of human subjects research means to really adequately assess the risks and benefits of a study upfront. So that's why when you go and you put forward your protocol, you have to be very carefully think about what are the risks and what are the benefits involved in this research. And finally, for justice, for them, that translated to fair procedures and outcomes in the selection of research subjects. So the background here was, back then, only your average white male would get into studies, and that wasn't up for them upholding this value of justice. So that's one example of this process of specification. Here's another one that's been top of mind for those who work in the AI space recently, and this is work that's come out of the AI data ethics literature. So people talk about fairness a lot, but what might that actually mean? If you are a product manager sitting down and trying to say, yeah, I want to respect fairness in this algorithm that I'm planning to put into my product that's going to have an impact on, sentencing or who gets this type of social support or whatever else. What does that actually mean? And there have been various definitions put forward for what algorithmic fairness might mean. They go under the titles of demographic parity, equalized odds, and predictive rate parity. And there's been quite a lot of work that's shown that you can't have all those things at once. So all of these things that we might intuitively think count as fairness when we're talking about an algorithm, you can't mutually satisfy them except in some edge cases. So it really is important to think about what is it that you're going after when you're talking about fairness. And here's another example from closer to home. We talk a lot about the equitable equity in the clinical use of polygenic risk scores. But what might be our specification of equity in that case? Do we mean equal predictive performance across these groups, which we can define any way we like, whether we're looking at self-reported race or ethnicity, or whether we're looking at genetically inferred continental categories? We see these very different predictive performance in these different groups. Would equity mean having similar predictive performance in those different groups? Or might it mean an equal ability to identify those at or above a certain risk level? And those two things might come apart if, for example, the prevalence of a certain condition is different by those groups. Or might we mean that we want them to have equitable impact on lives? Those all suggest actually different things that we should be aiming for or putting our energies towards. Okay. Third challenge to grapple with. How do we recognize where these values are being undermined? And as a reminder to go back to the beginning, by a value being undermined, that could be that a value was overlooked or that there are values in conflict or apparent conflict. So how do we recognize where they're being undermined? So recognizing something involves first identifying where a value might be being undermined, and then assessing whether it is in fact being undermined. It's not as simple as, oh, there's a potential harm here, potential risk in this value being undermined. We actually often have to do some work to assess whether it in fact is being undermined. So identifying these places, that might be the entry point. As we were saying at the start, unless we first reflect, it might be that there's some non-technical conflict within a team that might suggest there's an ethical issue, and that might be what gets the whole ball rolling. Or identification of an ethical issue could arise from a formal process of starting with the values. So maybe sitting down as a team and doing the exercise of thinking about the values that are important, and then seeing if any research directions were at risk of undermining any of those. It's identifying. And then you have to actually go and assess if the values are actually being undermined, which often involves going and gathering data. So the people who work in my field in LC do a mixture of normative and conceptual work and empirical work of going out and actually seeing what the state of affairs is. So let's talk about some examples. In the early days of, in sort of the 1990s and into the 2000s, a lot of bioethicists and others were really worried that genetic testing was going to do more harm than good. There was a huge amount of concern about that. So a concern that individuals would get depressed and anxious after receiving their results, that sharing genetic results might increase stigmatization of those who test for a genetic condition. And there were also concerns about, I'll come one second, an increase in genetic determinism and genetic essentialism. So genetic determinism being like, you've got this variant, you're definitely going to get this condition, and genetic essentialism just being, we're just the sum total of our genes and that's it. So, okay, so there they identified a potential value being undermined. So this is like, okay, whatever you think the benefits might be, we think that harms are going to outweigh them. So the value of non-maleficence, which is a fancy way of saying do no harm, is going to be undermined. And a lot of work went into assessing whether those risks in fact materialized, including by my PI, Robert Green, in many different trials. And those effects have largely not been found. There are some exceptions, but in general, people have been looking for these types of risks for a long time now in many different ways, and they haven't found much, which doesn't mean stop looking. It might be that we just haven't been asking in the right ways, or it might be that we haven't identified that there are particular subpopulations that really do, that end up impacted by some of these. But for the most part, there was an identification of a potential risk which hasn't really materialized. Okay. So what approaches allow us to uphold all the values identified? So at this stage, we might be thinking, well, actually, we have identified where there's some value that's being undermined. And the key step here is to expand the solution space and not jump too quickly to the assumption that there's an inevitable trade-off between the values that we care about. And the sort of challenge is to search for options that allow you to uphold all of these values simultaneously. So here's an example that's close to my heart. So differential performance of polygenic risk scores, as wonderfully illustrated by Alicia and colleagues, and in their paper was really framed as an ethical issue, right? So clinical use of current polygenic risk scores may exacerbate health disparities. So they're framing it very much as an equity issue. So we've got a risk of the value of equity being undermined. Right? On the other hand, a lot of the work that I've done with Ben and others has drawn attention to the fact that our field's use of continental ancestry categories can be problematic for scientific and ethical reasons. Sort of just reinforces this idea that humans come in a small number of basic types, and as we've mentioned before, that has had many damaging social consequences. So in presenting this work, it's sometimes this example that people bring up to me. It's like, but Anna, like, here's an example where without using those categories, it would have been really hard to have identified this really, really pressing issue in our field. And for a while, I was like, yeah, I agree. Like, I'm not saying you should never use these categories. You should just think carefully before you use them. And this is a great example of where it might make sense to use them to highlight this issue. But then came out this beautiful paper by Ding et al. This is Bogdan Pasanuric's group out of UCLA, where, I mean, their title says it all, that polygenic scoring accuracy varies across the genetic ancestry continuum in all human populations. So this is a great example of expanding the solution space. It's like you can draw attention to the issue without using these continental categories and actually kind of advance the science in so doing. Okay, so what if there are no such solutions that nicely allow you to uphold all the values you care about? Well, you have to make a hard choice. And that's a term that comes from a philosopher called Ruth Chang. And there's some lovely, very accessible YouTube clips of her explaining this in more depth in case you're interested. And what is a hard choice, or what does it involve? It means we have to resort to what she calls on-par reasoning, which is just to recognize that in making a choice, you are defining the values that are most important. And there's just no two ways about that. You just can't get away from the fact that when it comes down to it, that is what's going on. And there's no rule book for that. Being in a position to do this well involves cultivating capacities for judgment and justification rather than rigidly following rules. And that, in the philosophical literature, that's what we call virtue ethics. It's about focusing in on our capacities and who we are and how we make decisions. So you might just have to make a hard choice. And the other thing that you ought to do is mitigate against harms. So there might be some actions that you can take that sort of help and mitigate against the harms of undermining the value or values that you have deprioritized in making your hard choice. So let me share with you this example, which I faced in a couple of different big projects involving Brodies, of sharing less predictive polygenic risk scores with individuals with non-European genetic ancestries. So the situation, as I'm sure you all know, is that if we share currently available PRS with patients not well represented in the training data, the reports will be less accurate because they have lower predictive power. So should we share with them or not? And for simplicity, I've framed this in a type of black and white way, but we can also talk about if we set a threshold on predictive performance, it would still be the case that we were identifying a lower fraction of basically the non-white individuals than the others. But okay, basically two options, share or don't share. So in either case, equity is going to be impacted. In the first case, if we share, because the information is not equally predictive, and then also the value of non-maleficence might be being undermined if sharing scores that may be inaccurate is harmful. And notice my ifs, you'd have to go and assess these things. Okay, so, and this would be the sort of what probably most people in this field are assuming, that sharing polygenic risk scores with individuals is actually helpful, right? That's why we're embarking on this endeavor. Versus option 2, don't share. So here equity is going to be impacted because the scores are not going to be available to all, or going to be available to a smaller fraction, or the positive scores are going to be available to a smaller fraction of people of these non-white groups. And then also beneficence could be undermined if sharing scores that may be inaccurate is helpful. Right. So sorry, actually, this is what we all probably hope for, that sharing scores is helpful, and that these folks would be missing out if we were to take option 2. Okay, so here's a fork in the road, and as I said, I've faced this a couple of times, and I'm again going to give you just a minute to think through this one. How would you start to grapple with this issue? Yeah.
Were there principles from the earlier analyses that might have identified why the genetic information was not as harmful as had been predicted by bioethicists that could be applied here to similarly, like, kind of how people actually receiving information?
Ah, yes. Okay, so that's this idea that perhaps if we were to go for option 1, share, we might have some lessons that could be applied to sort of not overinterpret information. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Anybody else got any thoughts on this? Or any gut feelings about what option you would have done if this had been your team? Okay, or even to rewind to earlier in the talk, the steps that you might take and who you might go and talk to. So here, seeking out the voices of the individuals who would be impacted would be an obvious thing to do. And indeed, myself and others have gone to do that. And we've mocked up polygenic risk scores and put them under the noses of people in various different situations from various different groups, and explain to them what polygenic risk scores are, what the issue is, and got their opinion. And there have been a couple of such studies explicitly on polygenic risk scores, which just show kind of overwhelmingly that these individuals would prefer to have the scores shared with suitable caveats given. And that then actually is kind of bolstered by other research in other areas of genomics. For instance, APOE4 is less predictive in African Americans than it is in white Americans. But they still want to get that information. So it looks like we're going for sharing, option 1, which gets to your point about how might we then mitigate those harms, those potential harms, including information on the report against overinterpretation, and then being very cautious if recommending any clinical action that could have negative effects. And actually, all the ways that the clinical use of polygenic risk scores are being tested right now, most of the recommended actions have low chance of having negative effects. And frankly, a lot of them are just reiterate the existing guidelines, but that's another story. Okay. So in summary, we started with what an ethical issue was. And this is a definition I'm putting to you. You could come up with different ones. So it's where we risk courses of action that undermine some of our values because of conflict or apparent conflict between values, or because of failure to attend to a particular value. And then we went through sort of what applying the ethics lens, what that might look like, which is recognizing where we're undermining values we care about and then addressing them by seeking solutions that allow us to uphold those values to the best of our abilities. And what are the benefits of doing this process? Well, more ethically aligned research, hopefully, which we shouldn't have to further justify its worth. And also more transparency in why decisions were made in the way they were. Like, thinking in these terms can force us to specify, well, what do we actually mean by equity in this case? Or what is it really? We assume that this work is going to have great benefit, but let's cash out a little bit more what we take that to mean. And then particularly if you have had to make a hard choice, being able to clearly explain it and write it up alongside your science is, I think, very important. And then we went through some of the challenges that come up in this process of grappling with ethical issues. And here's the sort of nutshell version. It's challenging to think what values are important. And you really need to go away and not just have some self-reflection, but think about who else, which other groups' values might matter for your research. To think about what it might mean to uphold those values, which involves this process of specification, adding context to make them action guiding, again with stakeholder input. And then how recognizing where those values might be being undermined, which starts with an initial suspicion and is always confirmed with data. And then seeking to expand the solution space if we think that we're facing a conflict between values, maybe it's just an apparent conflict, and we can expand the solution space. And if there are no such solutions, then we can make hard choices and mitigate harms. Okay. So in closing, I just want to alert you to the BBI, which Alam here and myself are co-leads of, the Broad Bioethics Initiative. And here's from our intranet page. Broad's leadership in science and technology development includes a responsibility and an opportunity to also play a role in leading considerations of how these developments can and should impact people's lives. And that's important for an institution whose mission is explicitly to impact patients' lives, like the Broad. And very excited to announce a resource. Look out for an email from Steve in the next day or two about this. The Broad Research Ethics Consultancy, BREC, which is going to be a service to help Broadies navigate uncertainties that you might be wrestling with in your research that might have an ethical dimension. In other words, ethical issues. Thanks very much. Any questions?
You mentioned that in the early days of the Human Genome Project that there's concerns about the impact of genetic testing, and I'm wondering if there are similar ethical concerns where it's not really based on evidence, but some sort of like hypothetical, like this might happen and it might be a concern. Do you think it's justified to test those hypotheses, even though they might become ethical, like testing it might be an ethical concern?
Oh, you mean we're testing the hypotheses?
Well, if I can give an example.
Yeah, please.
Like, let's say I believe that everyone's DNA genome should be public, presumably. That might be a concern, but you don't know if that is actually a problem or not because it's never been done. So do you think
I see
something like that?
I would hope that one could break down the component pieces of that and learn in so doing. So there were things, so for example, there are projects, right, where people are encouraged to deposit their data publicly, like George Church has one such project. And Robert Green, my mentor, actually has a project wrapped around that project, which is looking at how people feel about things, how they think about some of the potential negative things. But we're also operating in a very uncertain landscape because technology is changing very fast. And that's something that it's very, very hard to think about, right? So for example, right now, your genome does not count as an identifier about you, according to regulations, which might seem a bit weird to many of you, but that is the case. And when that changes, lots of things are going to change. And why might it change? Well, it might change because there's more ways to link that identifying information to other sorts of information, and that changes the calculus. So it's definitely a particular challenge to think about how things are going to change in the medium term. Any other questions?
The consent process that we couldn't avoid in Seekaboo, which is this study to offer whole genome for babies who refer on newborn hearing screening. So they weren't necessarily going to turn out to for deafness.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found, and I discussed this with Flora, is that if I went into the room and there was a single mom who was very trusting of us, and I knew that she couldn't possibly understand what we were consenting her for. But if I went into the room where there were two attorneys, they would say no.
Mm-hmm. On what basis would they say no? Would they say why?
No. I mean,
Yeah.
we didn't probe them for that. They just did not want to participate.
Yeah. No, I think consent is very often underlooked because it has a huge, how consent is framed has just a phenomenal impact on who ends up recruited, be it in research or be it in clinical situations. And there's like a lot of evidence that shows that. Like if you go in and what you really try and do is get people to understand, then typically actually you don't have a particularly high fraction of people saying yes. I'm thinking about newborn screening for babies in particular. Versus if you have, let's say, a slightly more cursory consent process, then your rates look sky high. So I think it's a very challenging and somewhat open question, the extent to which we feel people need to understand at the point of consent. Yeah, and I mean, there are definitely best practices around that I'm sure that you're following. And I would be curious. I haven't heard anything specifically about attorneys in this context. I would be curious what's top of mind for them. Is it their knowledge of the legal landscape and lack of certain protections around genetic discrimination, or is it just general, like, that sounds like something that we don't need in the mix right now? That would be very interesting to work out. Yeah, yeah, it sounds like a frustrating situation to be in. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. I thought there was just one last question, which is if you are someone who's sitting in that room sensing a non-technical disagreement, what's your advice for kind of speaking up to make sure that research projects you're involved in or may see are really kind of adhering to the highest possible ethical principles?
Yeah, I mean, I think naming it and then raising it, I mean, if they feel comfortable, of course, raising it and just sort of as a query, like, so what do we think that's going on here, right? And then try and dig a bit deeper. And this BREC, which is staffed by myself, by Alam, and by a really amazing panel of ethicists, could also help, even if it's just, we've been a bit nervous about framing this as, oh, come to us if you have an ethical issue, because actually the most challenging thing is identifying the ethical issue in the first place. So I think if there was a sniff or a suspicion, that's also something that we could be a resource for.